The New York Times this week published an article by Jeremy Peters entitled, "It's Not Just Gaza." And Peters says it's not really about Gaza. Well, it is, but not just Gaza. The students who are mobilizing are a generation that is furious, and they have a lot to be righteously angry about. They are angry about police accountability. They are angry about racism. They are angry about resistance to gender equality. They are angry about assaults on reproductive freedoms. They are angry about transphobia. They are angry at the cruel targeting of people who are different. They are furious about the climate crisis. These American students are angry because they have lived most of their lives, 16 out of the average 18 to 22 of most university students, watching Obama and Trump and Biden fail to govern. They have never known an America that had bipartisan agreement. They have never known an America with a justice system that they trust. And it is only in the last 2 years, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that they have been alive in an America that was not at war. Universally, Peters reports, these protests use a shared language of intersectional liberation, capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. And from the start to finish, what Peters wants you to hear is clear, that these protests are a symptom of system-wide angst. And that's why you are finding a smattering of like-minded liberal Jews in the encampments and the protests. He argues that the war in Gaza is simply the outlet for generational anguish. And I believe him. I believe that he could be onto something, because I heard a very similar perspective from one of the brightest scholars of Zionism and Jewish history of our generation, an incredible university professor who I admire very much, just a week before this article came out. In a private email, they stated almost the exact same thing about the protests and encampments on their campus. And then I read another article this week, another excellent article by an Israeli attending Harvard whose name is Barak Sella, and he said it even more clearly. The campus protests are no longer about Israel, they are about America. And for us here in Canada, one can assume that an element of that is true as well. But where I disagree with Peters is the following presumption. He closes the article by interviewing 2 Jews who are active in the anti-Israel protests, who each say that they personally have never experienced any anti-Semitism. And in uplifting the experience of 2 people, he is painting a very broad picture, saying, well, this is not really about Gaza and Israel. It's really about one generation. It's not really even about this war. It's really about America, and these 2 Jews don't feel uncomfortable. So these protests, are they really a sign of anti-Semitism? And with that assumption, I could not disagree more. Because the history of the Jewish people is littered with moments of being blamed for the problems of society as a whole. The Jewish people have spent centuries being targeted because of issues related to global politics, or economic considerations, or the burning greater issues of the day. And all of it had very little to do with them as individuals, as Jews. And yet, the fires that were lit in those rage, it consumed them all the same. Yes, this outpouring of rage that we see in our streets today might in fact be about the intersectional deconstruction of colonialism and racism and the fight for climate justice. But why does it take a war in Israel to push everyone into the streets? How is it that once again it's the Jews that have lit the spark for this particular generational outcry? As Mark Twain might have said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Why? Why is this happening again? Why is there anti-Semitism? Why is there Jew hatred? This is one of those great questions that people of all generations ask, from our most senior members who have spent their life watching Jewish acceptance blossom here, and who now once again see hatred of the Jew as common in the streets of Canada. And it's a common question in the children in our school, who are learning either for the first time or in standing up for themselves for the first time, that their Jewishness has singled them out in a negative way. An answer to this question is found in our weekly Torah portion. The words we just read, Kadoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. You will be holy, for I, Adonai, your God, am holy. And a fundamental understanding of what it means to be holy is to be separate, to be different, to put aside. And this can be a hard definition to immediately grasp, because so often we associate the word holiness with goodness, or with purity, or with superiority. So the easiest way I can make this point clear is by describing, of all things, a wedding. We sanctify a couple at a wedding. We make a relationship holy. What does that mean? Does that mean that we make a relationship good? No. Please, God, your relationship is good long before you get to the chuppah. Does that mean that we make a relationship better? When we make you holy, does that mean this bride and this groom, this happy couple, are better, superior to everyone else that's ever been married? No, obviously not. When we create holiness at a wedding, we set a couple apart. And we say, you are now for you and only for you. You are holy to each other. You are only for each other. And you're going to have many other beautiful, wonderful, meaningful relationships. But the holiness of this relationship is reliant on the fact that it is exclusively for the two of you. And this is the monogamous relationship that is supposed to exist between the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and our God. And to be in a monogamous relationship with God, there are supposed to be, like in all monogamous relationships, certain unique rituals and ways of being that mark a special, unique bond that demonstrate how we are different from other relationships, other nations, other peoples, just as they should have unique rituals and unique ways which are different from us. And ours are Shabbat and Kashrut, and our own calendar, and our own sacred texts, and our own holidays, our own language. These things put us aside from the rest of the world, and we wrestle with that choice. We have wrestled with it throughout generations, but we make it, and we make it again and again. And this idea that we have intentionally made ourselves holy, and simultaneously we have intentionally made ourselves other, because our otherness has a higher purpose. And that otherness simultaneously puts a target on us. It makes for the proposed root of Jew hatred, the proposed root of anti-Semitism. Because we know, sadly, that people don't like those who are different from them. But that doesn't answer this fundamental uniqueness, it seems, of Jew hatred. Lots of people are different. In fact, one could argue that everyone is different. So why does the Jew get so much hatred of all of the nations that are different? And the second answer to this question is a more complex bit of history around the development of Western civilization. And it has to do with the unique relationship between Judaism and Christianity and Judaism and Islam. And there are those who point to theological elements, such as verses in the Gospels and in the Quran where the Jews are blamed for the death of Jesus or depicted as enemies of the Prophet Muhammad, but blaming the religious inclinations of all Muslims and all Christians for anti-Semitism is unfair, because it ignores the golden ages, the hundreds of years where Jews lived peacefully with our neighbors, and they were still people of deep faith at that time. It is one of the most complex things possible to boil down the relationship between three of the world's great religions into a minute, but if one could fairly do so, one might say we're just back to that first point again, that we are not the same, and that these other two religions were the dominant force of Western civilization, and both of them viewed the Jewish people as other, as different, and we are different. And this difference has, at the best of times, been respected and understood in the full meaning of kadoshim, of holiness. You are holy, and we too are holy. For we too have a special and unique relationship with that one God. And God is large enough. God is perhaps the only thing large enough for all of us to have a special and unique relationship that does not in any way diminish the other. And at the worst of times, that understanding of difference was filled with supersessionism and dominance and persecution and hatred. And that hostility has lingered in the world, even when the origins of that influence may have changed or grown or adapted. In her article, The Return of the Big Lie, Dara Horn, author of People Love Dead Jews, quoting the scholar David Nierenberg, argues that most societies are rooted in Western culture, from ancient civilization to our current post-religious society, all of these societies that exist in opposition to an other. And all too often that other is considered Judaism. This has little to do with actual Judaism and a lot to do with whatever evil these non-Jewish cultures aspire to overcome, she writes. If piety was a given society's ideal, then Jews are impious blasphemers. And if secularism is the ideal, then Jews are backwards pietists. If capitalism is evil, then Jews are capitalist. And if communism is evil, Jews are communist. If nationalism is glorified, Jews are rootless cosmopolitans, and if nationalism is vilified, then Jews are chauvinist nationalists. Anti-Judaism is always a fight to promote justice. And so we return to those outside our doors who are fighting for justice, and in doing so are fighting against Israel. As Barak Sella, that Israeli student at Harvard, says in his article, American youth is full of political energy and nowhere to channel it. When societies reach a crisis, they have exactly two options: to think about what they can do or to think about who they can blame. And when you walk through these protest encampments, it's clear where we're putting our blame. Why don't we have universal health care, military funding for Israel? Why is there police brutality towards people of color? Because of Israel police training. Why do progressive candidates lose in the midterms? Because of the Israel lobby. What the Israeli government does or doesn't do now no longer really matters. It has become fixed as the villain responsible for America's problems. Yes, says Peters and Sella and many other voices, the protests in America and Canada are more than just about Gaza and the Palestinians. They are the outcry of a generation that has been denied justice and opportunity. They see a world that is on fire. This is true. And yes, those protests are following the same well-trod path of many other movements in the history of human beings. They argue that to find justice, to fix society, you must overcome the other who represents these problems. And this time, just like so many other times, the protesters have found their other in Israel, in the Zionist, and in any Jew who will not join their movement. And when we are made into the other, an other which is stripped of holiness, an other which is stripped of purpose that gives meaning to that very state, we have the right to call the source of our dread and the explicit targeting of our community by exactly what it is. Allow me a moment, as I close, to offer up something in the language of the encampments. Progressive thinkers argue that there are innate biases in our world, which we inherit as part of society. We don't necessarily think about these biases. We don't even necessarily know we have them, but they influence us. It's why someone might not fully listen to a female colleague, but then pay attention when a male colleague repeats the same exact idea just a moment later. It's these same biases which make us, when we walk down the street, make a note of someone of color, or someone who's clearly observant of a different religion, when we would simply walk past a person who looked like us without thinking. And when these biases are pointed out, it is sadly often with weaponized language. It is said, or perhaps it is heard, that you are racist, you are a misogynist, when what is being said is you have internalized racism, you have internalized misogyny, because everyone, including the minorities that these biases harm, have internalized some amount of prejudice, because that's simply part of hundreds, thousands of years of societal norms. And so progressive ideology argues that the hard work then of shifting societal norms is recognizing, naming, and undoing these biases in incremental steps. So dream with me, wonder with me for a moment. If we can acknowledge that there is, in our greater society, in Western civilization, internalized racism, if we can acknowledge that there are very many good people walking around that have internalized misogyny, could we acknowledge that in our world today, there is also widespread internalized anti-Semitism? And if we did, could we as a civilization be honest about what we see right now in our world, on our campuses, and on our streets? Could we see why this conflict, this war, has inflamed the passions of so many people when those same people are arguing that it's really about so much else? And could those who give so much thought to liberation, to universal uplift, to intersectionality, turn that lens inside and see a bias and perhaps reevaluate their words, their actions, and their tactics as they would for any other minority group that feels targeted and feels afraid? I don't know how we get there. But I know that if we did so, if we started treating anti-Semitism with the same honest critique that all of the other forms of hatred receive, by acknowledging that yes, we are different, and that we deserve the same justice as everyone else, we might just find the world a holier place once again. Shabbat Shalom.